where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
They whispered behind silk fans that she'd missed her chance, that time had rendered her invisible in a world obsessed with youth and urgency. At 40 and unmarried, Lady Arabella had become London society's favorite cautionary tale. Proof, they claimed, of what happens when women wait too long, demand too much, refuse to settle for whatever scraps the marriage market offers. But here's the forbidden truth nobody saw coming, the revelation that would shatter every cruel assumption they'd made. While they were mocking her supposed failure, the most coveted bachelor in England, the Duke of Ravenswood himself, a man who'd rejected countless younger, more suitable prospects, was falling irrevocably in love with everything they'd dismissed as worthless. This isn't some fairy tale about luck or exception. It's about the dangerous secret society desperately hides from you, that everything you've been told about age, worth, and the supposed urgency to couple up before your value expires is a calculated lie designed to keep you desperate, diminished, and willing to accept less than you deserve. What if I told you that the panic you feel about time running out, about being left behind, about needing to settle before it's too late? What if all of that urgency was deliberately manufactured to control you? Society profits enormously from your fear. Desperate women spend more money on anti-aging solutions, tolerate worse treatment from mediocre men, and remain easier to manipulate because they believe their options are vanishing with every birthday. But Lady Arabella discovered something that changes everything, a truth so powerful it transformed her from overlooked to utterly magnetic. The moment she stopped seeking validation and started building genuine self-worth, the moment she chose peace over panic and substance over performance, she became irresistible to exactly the kind of man worth having. Not because she got lucky or stumbled into some exception, but because she unlocked the actual codes of attraction that nobody teaches. Codes that have nothing to do with youth and everything to do with depth, authenticity, and the kind of confidence that only comes from truly knowing and loving yourself. In the next 38 minutes, I'm going to reveal exactly how she did it. The specific transformations that took her from accepting crumbs to being chosen by someone who could have anyone. You'll discover the 4 things she stopped doing that immediately elevated her magnetism, the invisible qualities that actually attract evolved men while repelling immature boys, and the practical steps you can implement today to develop the same presence regardless of your age. But more importantly, you're going to see through the conspiracy that's been keeping you small, understand why society lies about your worth, and learn to make decisions from power rather than panic. This isn't about tricks or manipulation. It's about becoming so genuinely complete and confident that you naturally attract partnership that enhances your already fulfilling life rather than desperately seeking someone to complete you. Fair warning. What you're about to learn contradicts everything society's taught you about feminine value, and once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. So if you're ready to stop accepting the lies and start claiming the love you actually deserve, stay with me. Because Lady Arabella's story is about to become your blueprint for transformation. There's this cruel whisper that travels through ballrooms and tea parties, a silent conspiracy that wraps itself around women's hearts like ivy around an old castle wall. They'll tell you there's a clock ticking, that your worth diminishes with every candle on your birthday cake. That desperation should replace discernment once you hit a certain age. But here's the enigma nobody talks about. What if the entire narrative is designed to keep you small, afraid, and willing to accept crumbs instead of the feast you deserve? Picture Lady Arabella, 38, sitting across from Lord Pemberton, who can barely remember her name between checking his pocket watch, yet she's nodding along because society's drumbeat echoes in her mind. Time's running out. Time's running out. The vestiges of her self-respect crumble, with each forced smile, each laugh at his mediocre jokes, each moment she pretends his indifference doesn't sting like winter frost on bare skin. Now, let me share something that'll shift your entire perspective. Something hidden beneath layers of societal conditioning and fear-mongering. That evening, as Arabella walked home alone through cobblestone streets, something crystallized in her consciousness. A revelation so profound, it felt like unlocking a forbidden door she didn't know existed. "I'd rather embrace solitude with peace," she whispered to the moon, "than endure companionship laced with constant anguish and compromise." Think about forced relationships like spoiled food at a banquet. Sure, you might swallow it when you're starving, convinced it's your last chance to eat, but your body will reject it eventually, leaving you sicker than if you'd simply waited for genuine nourishment. The silence of her empty manor suddenly felt less like punishment and more like sanctuary, a space where she could finally hear her own thoughts without the conflicting noise of someone else's half-hearted affection. Here's where it gets interesting, where the hidden truth emerges from shadows. Society loves presenting you with false dichotomies, particularly this one. You're either a fine wine that ages gracefully or spoiled milk that expires by 40. But what if you reject both metaphors entirely? What if you're actually a rare manuscript, gaining value, depth, and irreplaceable wisdom with each passing year? Lady Arabella at 40 possessed something her younger self never could. She'd decoded the patterns, recognized the red flags from miles away, and developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish genuine connection from performance. She'd lived through enough conflicts and disappointments to know exactly what she wouldn't tolerate anymore. And paradoxically, this selectivity made her more magnetic, not less. The urgency society manufactures isn't about biology or compatibility. It's about keeping you compliant, grateful for whatever attention comes your way, too afraid to demand what you actually deserve. Let's talk about what really happens when you operate from scarcity versus abundance, because this secret changes everything. When Arabella accepted that disastrous encounter with Lord Pemberton at 38, she was operating from a place of panic, as if her value was disappearing like morning mist. Every compromised boundary, every ignored instinct, every moment of pretending to be smaller than she was. These weren't acts of love or flexibility. They were symptoms of believing the lie that time was her enemy. But here's what the hidden records actually show, what they don't want broadcasted across society. Noble women who entered marriages after 40, armed with self-knowledge and clear standards, reported significantly higher satisfaction than those who settled earlier out of fear. They knew their non-negotiables, they'd built complete lives, and they refused to dim their light for anyone's comfort. The mystery isn't how some women find love after 40. It's how anyone finds genuine love while operating from desperation at any age. Consider the hidden codes of attraction that nobody teaches you in those romance novels or society guidelines. Real magnetism doesn't come from availability or youth. It emerges from someone who's done the internal work, who radiates contentment rather than need, who brings depth instead of just beauty. Lady Arabella had spent years chasing validation, measuring her worth by male attention, accepting breadcrumbs and calling them banquets. But something shifted after that awful encounter with Pemberton, after she finally admitted that loneliness felt infinitely better than the wrong companionship. She stopped attending every ball, desperately scanning for prospects, stopped analyzing every gentleman's glance for hidden meanings, stopped contorting herself into shapes that might appeal to men who barely knew themselves. And paradoxically, the moment she stopped desperately seeking, she became infinitely more fascinating. Not because she played games, but because she genuinely didn't need rescue anymore. She'd become her own fortress, complete and unshakable. The disappearance of her desperation created space for something entirely different to emerge: authentic power. Think about it. When you're frantically trying to catch something, your energy screams, "I'm incomplete without this." But when you're genuinely content, pursuing your passions, building your empire whether anyone's watching or not, you emit an entirely different frequency. Arabella started investing in herself like she was her own most important project. Not superficial investments in rouge and powder or desperate attempts to look younger, but deep soul work. Long walks through her estate gardens where she excavated childhood wounds, philosophical texts that expanded her consciousness, charitable works that made her genuinely proud of who she was becoming. And here's the paradox that'll blow your mind. The less she needed a relationship to validate her existence, the more attractive she became to gentlemen who actually had something substantial to offer. Young lords want someone to complete them. Mature dukes want someone who inspires them to become better versions of themselves. Let me paint you a picture of what this transformation actually looked like in practice. Because abstract concepts don't change lives, specific actions do. Lady Arabella stopped apologizing for taking up space, for having opinions that challenged convention, for wanting more than society suggested she deserved. At dinner parties, instead of nodding politely while gentlemen explained topics she knew intimately, she'd engage with her full intelligence, offering insights about estate management and political philosophy that made people lean forward rather than tune out. She pursued advanced studies in literature and languages she'd postponed, traveled to the continent unchaperoned, scandalous but thrilling, invested in friendships with other accomplished women with the same devotion she'd once reserved for mediocre romantic prospects. Her days filled with activities that genuinely lit her up. Not strategic positioning to meet potential suitors, but authentic engagement with life itself. And something curious happened. The vestiges of that desperate 38-year-old vanished completely, replaced by someone who knew her value wasn't determined by marriage status or age, but by the richness of her inner world and the impact she made on her community. But here's where most people misunderstand the entire journey, where the real enigma reveals itself. This wasn't about Lady Arabella becoming cold or building walls. It was about becoming whole. She didn't stop wanting love or companionship. She simply refused to accept counterfeits anymore. The standards she developed weren't arbitrary or superficial. They were born from hard-won wisdom about what actually sustains connection beyond initial attraction. She knew now that shared values mattered more than shared estates, that emotional depth trumped title rankings, that someone's capacity for growth and self-reflection determined long-term compatibility far more than their ability to plan impressive courtship gestures. And as she settled deeper into this truth, as she stopped checking her reflection in others' eyes and started trusting her own vision, something began shifting in ways she couldn't yet see. The universe has curious ways of responding when you finally stop chasing and start becoming, when you transform from someone seeking completion into someone offering genuine partnership. And it was precisely at this moment of total self-possession that the most unexpected chapter of her story was about to begin. Let me tell you about the 4 transformations that turned Lady Arabella from invisible to irresistible. And here's the secret nobody wants you to discover. It wasn't about becoming more, it was about stopping the self-betrayal that kept her small. The first shift happened at a dinner hosted by the Duke of Somerset, where she found herself seated beside Lord Hastings, a gentleman known for his financial acumen and insufferable need to demonstrate it. For years, Arabella had played a particular role at such gatherings. She'd pretend ignorance about subjects she understood deeply, ask simpering questions to make men feel intelligent, dim her own light so theirs could shine brighter. That evening, when conversation turned to estate investments and the new railway ventures, Lord Hastings launched into an explanation of capital allocation as if teaching a child about counting coins. The old Arabella would have nodded adoringly, but something had shifted in her core, some forbidden defiance that refused to play small anymore. So she did something radical, something that felt like breaking an unspoken conspiracy of feminine diminishment. She engaged with her full intelligence. "Actually, Lord Hastings, I've been studying the railway proposals extensively," she said, her voice steady and clear as church bells. "While the Northern Line shows promise, the geological surveys suggest significant engineering challenges that the prospectus conveniently omits. I've redirected my investments toward the Manchester cotton mills instead. The returns may be slower, but the risk profile is considerably more favorable." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, pregnant with potential energy. Lord Hastings blinked rapidly, his rehearsed explanations dying on his lips. And here's where the enigma deepened. Instead of warming to her competence, he cooled like September frost creeping across window panes. Within 20 minutes, he'd excused himself to speak with more suitable company, and the old Arabella would have felt crushing shame, proof that being smart made her unlovable. But the new Arabella understood something profound, a revelation that would change everything. A light that's deliberately extinguished doesn't illuminate anyone. It just wastes the energy it was born to radiate. Lord Hastings didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience, someone to reflect his own perceived brilliance back at him without adding challenging dimensions. And here's the brutal truth they don't teach you in those etiquette lessons. Men who need you small are terrified of their own inadequacy. When you shrink yourself, you're not making space for connection. You're enabling their cowardice, their refusal to grow into someone worthy of your actual depth. Arabella realized that evening that she'd spent decades auditioning for roles in other people's plays, contorting her authentic self into whatever shape might earn approval, and the exhaustion of that performance had nearly destroyed her. The vestiges of that people-pleasing version of herself crumbled like ancient parchment, revealing someone far more interesting underneath. The second transformation involved something even more radical. Arabella stopped being emotionally available every waking moment, stopped making herself the solution to everyone else's needs while neglecting her own. Before her awakening, she'd been the woman who responded to correspondence within hours, who canceled her own plans the moment someone expressed need, who existed in a constant state of vigilant availability as if her worth depended on immediate usefulness. When Baron Whitmore began courting her the previous spring, she'd rearranged her entire existence around his schedule, abandoning her morning rides, her reading hours, her charitable work, all to ensure she never kept him waiting, never appeared anything less than completely devoted. And you know what that desperation accomplished? It made her forgettable, interchangeable, as interesting as wallpaper because she had no life beyond reflecting his needs back at him. The mystery isn't why he eventually lost interest. It's why she thought erasing herself would make her more lovable. After her revelation, Arabella reconstructed her days around her own fulfillment, and the shift felt like learning to breathe after years underwater. She resumed her morning rides through the countryside, joined a literary salon that met weekly to discuss philosophy and contemporary writing, rekindled friendships she'd neglected, and committed to her charitable work with renewed passion. When gentlemen sent correspondence now, she responded when convenient, not instantaneously, not as manipulation, but because she genuinely had a rich life that didn't revolve around male attention. Real mystery isn't playing games or withholding artificially, she'd explained to her friend Lady Margaret. It's having a life so genuinely interesting that you're not perpetually available because you're actually doing fascinating things. This wasn't about being cold or distant. It was about being whole, complete, engaged with existence beyond the narrow channel of romantic pursuit. And paradoxically, this made her infinitely more magnetic because men could sense she wasn't auditioning anymore. She was simply living, and they could either add value to her already fulfilling life or remain peripheral to it. The third shift cut even deeper, striking at the root of everything society had taught her about feminine worth. Arabella stopped seeking external validation for her value, stopped checking her reflection in other people's eyes to confirm she mattered. For decades, she'd measured herself through male attention. Did he look at her across the ballroom? Did he seek her company? Did he find her desirable? Each glance or dismissal felt like a verdict on her fundamental worthiness, and this exhausting vigilance had kept her in a perpetual state of anxiety. Always performing, always anxious about whether her performance was adequate. Think about it like this. When you look in a mirror and genuinely appreciate what you see, not narcissism, but solid self-acceptance, you don't need a crowd of strangers validating your reflection to believe it's real. But when your self-image depends entirely on others' responses, you become a chameleon constantly shifting, never certain of your true form, exhausted from the endless adaptation. Arabella's breakthrough came during a month-long retreat to her countryside estate, away from London's social circus and its relentless judgment. Alone with her thoughts, her books, her daily routines of riding and writing and managing her properties, she discovered something extraordinary. She liked herself. Not the carefully curated version she presented at balls, but her actual self, her sharp wit, her unconventional opinions, her passionate interests in subjects considered unladylike, her ambitious dreams that exceeded society's narrow definition of feminine aspiration. She started a daily practice of writing in her journal, documenting her thoughts without censoring them for imaginary audiences. And in those pages, she found a woman far more interesting than the one she'd been performing. The codes of social acceptance had kept her imprisoned in a character she didn't even enjoy playing, and liberation felt like removing a corset after years of restricted breathing. When she returned to London society, something had fundamentally shifted. She no longer scanned rooms for male approval because she'd already approved of herself. The fourth transformation was perhaps the most forbidden, the one that challenges everything you've been taught about making yourself palatable to potential partners. Arabella stopped being afraid of scaring men away with her full, unfiltered authenticity. She'd spent years moderating her opinions, softening her ambitions, hiding her intelligence and passion behind practiced feminine deference, because society whispered the same terrifying secret. Strong women die alone. Powerful women intimidate men. Ambitious women sacrifice love. So she'd made herself smaller, quieter, less threatening, believing this compromise would earn her the companionship she craved. But here's the hidden truth, the revelation that changes everything. Men of genuine value, the dukes and lords who've done their own internal work, who've evolved beyond fragile ego and insecurity, they don't want diminished women. They want partners who challenge them, inspire them, push them toward their own greatness through example and honest engagement. At a political salon, when the conversation turned to the Corn Laws and economic policy, Arabella offered a passionate, informed critique that silenced the room, not because she was wrong, but because she was right and unafraid to articulate complexity with conviction. Lord Bennet, a typically vocal participant, actually stopped mid-sentence to listen, and afterward approached her not with wounded pride, but with evident fascination. "Most women pretend politics bore them," he observed, and Arabella's response captured her entire transformation. "Most women have learned that pretending ignorance is safer than demonstrating competence. But I'm done sacrificing my authentic self for the comfort of men who can't handle intellectual equals." Some gentlemen recoiled from her directness, confirming they weren't worthy of her time anyway. But others, specifically, one particular duke whose arrival in London was causing considerable social disruption, leaned in, intrigued rather than threatened, drawn to her substance rather than repelled by her strength. And it was this unapologetic authenticity, this refusal to diminish herself for anyone's comfort, that would soon attract attention from the most unexpected source. Now, let me reveal the secret ingredient that transformed Lady Arabella from overlooked to utterly captivating. And I promise you, it wasn't what society's been selling. It wasn't her appearance, her wealth, or even her wit, though she possessed all three in abundance. The real magnetism came from something far more rare, something most people spend their entire lives avoiding because it requires courage most never develop: genuine emotional depth and the willingness to exist without masks. You see, there's this hidden conspiracy in polite society where everyone performs carefully rehearsed versions of themselves, offering pleasantries and surface-level charm while keeping anything real locked away like forbidden treasures in castle vaults. But Arabella had reached a point where performance exhausted her more than vulnerability scared her, and this shift created an energy that drew certain people toward her like moths to flame. Specifically, a particular duke who'd grown weary of London's shallow social theatre. Their first encounter happened at Lord Ashford's library gathering, an intimate affair for those genuinely interested in literature rather than social climbing. The Duke of Ravenswood had attended reluctantly, dragged by his sister, who insisted he needed to stop brooding in that estate like some Gothic villain and actually engage with civilization. Arabella arrived late, windswept from her ride, still carrying the philosophical text she'd been annotating, completely unaware that the most eligible man in England was standing near the fireplace, looking magnificently bored. She didn't notice him initially because she wasn't scanning for prospects anymore. She was genuinely there for the discussion about contemporary German philosophy. When their eyes finally met across the room, she didn't deploy any of the calculated flirtation tactics she'd once mastered. She simply smiled naturally and returned her attention to the conversation happening around her. This apparent disinterest wasn't strategy. It was authentic engagement with something she found more immediately interesting than romantic possibility. What happened next would become the stuff of whispered speculation throughout London's drawing rooms. But here's the real story, stripped of embellishment and social mythology. The Duke approached her during a lull in conversation, and instead of the typical opening gambits about weather or mutual acquaintances, he asked what she thought about the philosophical text in her hands. Arabella could have played coy, could have deflected with feminine modesty, but she'd abandoned those performance tactics entirely. So she told him, honestly, passionately, articulately, about her struggles with Kant's categorical imperative, her disagreements with certain premises, her attempts to reconcile philosophical idealism with the messy reality of human behavior. And instead of glazing over or feeling threatened by her intellectual engagement, the Duke pulled up a chair. 4 hours dissolved like morning mist as they debated philosophy, shared stories of personal loss and transformation, discussed their separate journeys toward understanding themselves beyond society's expectations. The mystery wasn't that they talked for hours, It was that neither was performing. Both were simply being real. Here's where conventional wisdom fails spectacularly, where the hidden truth reveals itself. The average man wants a woman who looks perfect in candlelight and stays silent in conversation. But a man of genuine substance, the kind who's done his own soul work, wants a woman who's more like a complex novel than a magazine cover. He wants depth, unexpected plot twists, chapters that challenge him, themes that make him think long after he's finished reading. The Duke later confessed to his sister that Arabella was the first woman in years who hadn't treated conversation with him as an audition for the role of Duchess. She asked questions born from genuine curiosity rather than strategic information gathering, shared vulnerabilities without weaponizing them for sympathy, challenged his assumptions without making it combative. The vestiges of his carefully maintained emotional walls began crumbling during that first conversation, recognizing in her something rare, someone who'd stopped pretending long enough to become actually interesting. The second element of Arabella's invisible magnetism was even more powerful, even more rare in a society built on drama and manipulation. She radiated genuine peace, not the artificial calm of repressed emotion or the fragile serenity of someone avoiding conflict, but the deep, unshakable peace of someone who'd faced their demons, processed their wounds, and emerged whole on the other side. She didn't create drama to test his interest, didn't manufacture conflicts to gauge his commitment, didn't employ any of the emotional manipulation tactics that had become second nature to her younger self. When the Duke mentioned he needed space to handle estate business for a week, the old Arabella would have spiraled into anxiety, reading, abandonment into his need for autonomy. The new Arabella simply said, "Of course, I have my own projects to focus on. Let me know when you're free." This wasn't playing it cool, it was genuinely being fine, because her emotional stability didn't depend on constant reassurance. Think about it this way. Drama creates intensity, which people often mistake for passion or connection. But intensity burns hot and fast, consuming everything until only ashes remain. Peace, real peace, born from internal work and healed wounds, that creates sustainability. Drama might attract temporary curiosity, like a fire in the distance drawing spectators. But peace, genuine emotional regulation and contentment, that attracts permanence, because it's the only environment where real love can actually grow. The Duke had experienced plenty of dramatic women, those who created constant turbulence to maintain his attention, who transformed every minor disagreement into emotional warfare. Arabella's peace felt revolutionary, like discovering a calm harbor after years navigating stormy seas. He could breathe around her, could be himself without constantly managing her emotional volatility, could trust that her stability wasn't dependent on his constant emotional labor. This peace wasn't boring. It was liberating, creating space for genuine intimacy rather than exhausting maintenance of manufactured intensity. The third element completed the trinity of invisible magnetism, the final piece that made Arabella utterly irresistible to a man of the Duke's caliber. She had a complete, fulfilling life entirely independent of him. When he asked about her week, she had genuine stories. The orphanage she was helping establish, the investment opportunity she was analyzing, the challenging novel she was translating from French, the complex estate management decision she was navigating. She wasn't waiting by the window for his visits. She was building something meaningful with or without romantic companionship. The Duke found himself competing for space in her calendar, not because she was playing games, but because she genuinely had commitments that mattered to her. And paradoxically, this made him want more of her time, made him recognize the value of what she was offering. Not desperate availability, but the choice to prioritize him within an already rich existence. Here's the codes nobody explains properly. When two incomplete people come together, they create a relationship of mutual dependency, each trying to extract from the other what they haven't developed in themselves. It's exhausting, suffocating, ultimately unsustainable. But when two complete people come together, two individuals who've built fulfilling lives independently, they create abundance rather than neediness, expansion rather than contraction, partnership rather than parasitic attachment. The Duke recognized in Arabella something he'd been searching for without knowing how to articulate it. A woman who didn't need him to complete her story, but chose to let him enhance an already compelling narrative. She wasn't a project requiring fixing, a void demanding filling, or an empty canvas waiting for him to paint meaning onto it. She was a masterpiece already, and he had the privilege of appreciating the art while adding his own complementary strokes. And it was precisely this dynamic, her wholeness meeting his evolution, that would soon transform both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated, setting the stage for a love that would defy every rule society had written. Let me tell you about the moment everything shifted, when the impossible became reality, in a way that made London's gossips choke on their tea and rethink every cruel assumption they'd made. The Duke of Ravenswood wasn't just any gentleman. He was the most pursued bachelor in England, the subject of countless matrimonial schemes, the man every ambitious mother wanted for her daughter, and every fortune hunter plotted to ensnare. Titled wealthy, devastatingly handsome, and infuriatingly selective, he'd remained unmarried well into his 30s despite an endless parade of eligible women throwing themselves at his feet. The enigma that haunted every drawing room was simple. What could possibly capture the attention of a man who seemed immune to feminine charms? The secret, as it turned out, wasn't about capturing attention at all. It was about not trying to, about being so genuinely engaged with your own life that you become magnetic without effort or strategy. The context of their deepening connection matters enormously because it reveals truths about authentic attraction that society deliberately obscures. Arabella wasn't at some ball in her finest gown, wasn't strategically positioned where eligible men gathered, wasn't even particularly looking for romance when their paths kept intersecting. She'd been attending a series of lectures on natural philosophy at the Royal Society. Scandalous for a woman, but she'd stopped caring about arbitrary rules that limited her growth. The Duke attended the same lectures, genuinely interested in scientific advancement, and kept noticing this woman who asked the most insightful questions, who challenged the speakers respectfully but firmly, who was so absorbed in learning that she seemed oblivious to the stares her presence generated. Their conversations began organically, born from shared intellectual curiosity rather than romantic agenda. And this foundation changed everything. There was no performance, no hidden motive, no silence filled with unspoken calculations. Just two minds engaging freely. After their fifth meeting, a lengthy discussion following a particularly controversial lecture on evolutionary theory, the Duke said something that crystallized why their connection felt different from anything he'd experienced before. They were walking through the rain-dampened streets, sharing an umbrella, when he stopped and turned to face her directly. "Lady Arabella," he said, his voice carrying unusual vulnerability, "you don't need me. Every other woman I've courted has approached our interactions as if I were oxygen and they were drowning. But you'd be perfectly fine if I disappeared tomorrow. You choose my company rather than require it, and I cannot articulate how profoundly that changes everything." The revelation hung between them like morning mist, this forbidden truth that neediness repels while choice attracts. Arabella smiled, understanding completely what he meant because she'd learned it through painful experience. "Your Grace," she replied, "I spent years drowning and grabbing at anyone who floated by. Now I've learned to swim. I don't need a life raft. I want a companion who enjoys exploring the depths with me." This distinction between needing and choosing is where most relationships either flourish or suffocate. Yet nobody teaches you this crucial difference. Think about it like sitting in a chair. An insecure person grips the chair arms desperately, terrified of falling, every muscle tense with fear of losing stability. But a secure person sits comfortably, trusting their own balance, able to stand up and walk away whenever appropriate without catastrophic anxiety. The Duke had been courted by countless women who gripped desperately, whose entire identities seemed wrapped up in securing him, whose peace appeared contingent on his commitment. The pressure of being someone's entire source of happiness is suffocating, turning romance into responsibility, affection into obligation. But Arabella sat comfortably in her own life, and her invitation to share space in it felt like freedom rather than imprisonment. She had options, other suitors, fulfilling friendships, meaningful work, but actively chose to prioritize him. This active choice, renewable daily, created attraction that desperation never could. What others couldn't understand, what had London social circles buzzing with confused speculation, was how a woman of 40 had captivated the man everyone else had failed to interest. "She's not even trying," Lady Thornbury complained at a garden party, watching the Duke seek Arabella's company with unmistakable intent. No elaborate gowns, no calculated flirtation, no feminine wiles. What spell has she cast? But that was precisely the point. The hidden codes that reveal how authentic magnetism actually works. While younger women presented themselves as blank canvases, ready to be shaped by his preferences, as projects requiring his guidance, as incomplete puzzles needing his piece to become whole, Arabella presented as a complete painting that happened to complement his frame beautifully. She had substance, depth, lived experience, wisdom earned through hardship, authentic confidence born from self-knowledge. She wasn't selling potential or promising transformation into whatever he wanted. She was offering reality, take it or leave it, no negotiation on her fundamental self. The truth that made others uncomfortable, the revelation that threatened their entire understanding of feminine value, was brutally simple. While they'd been marketing their appearance and youth, Arabella had been developing her essence. Think about the difference between a beautiful but empty mansion and a modest home filled with warmth, books, conversation, laughter, and genuine life. The mansion photographs beautifully, impresses at first glance, but reveals its hollowness quickly. The home might not win architectural awards, but people never want to leave because something real exists within those walls. The Duke had toured countless mansions, been impressed superficially, but left unsatisfied by the emptiness. Arabella's essence felt like coming home after years of cold, impressive structures that never warmed his soul. Her depth, her authenticity, her refusal to perform or pretend. These qualities created intimacy that perfect appearances never could. She shared her actual thoughts, revealed her genuine vulnerabilities, admitted her uncertainties without weaponizing them for sympathy or manipulation. During their courtship, if you could call it that, since it felt more like two complete people deciding to combine their already fulfilling lives, the Duke confided something that explained his years of apparent disinterest in marriage. "Every woman I've courted presented a performance, a carefully curated version of themselves designed to appeal to what they assumed I wanted. But personalities aren't clothing. You change based on your audience. I knew that whoever I eventually chose, I'd be spending decades with the real person, not the performance. And the inevitable disappointment when the mask dropped seemed worse than remaining alone. Arabella understood completely, had lived the exhaustion of constant performance herself. "I'm too tired to pretend anymore, Your Grace," she told him honestly. "What you see is what you get. My sharp tongue, my unconventional interests, my stubbornness about certain principles, my scars from past mistakes. I won't always be easy, but I'll always be real." And paradoxically, this warning made him more certain than ever, because authenticity promises sustainability, while performance guarantees eventual collapse. But perhaps the most powerful element of their connection, the vestiges of wisdom that elevated their relationship beyond typical courtship, was their shared understanding that partnership should enhance life rather than define it. Neither was looking to be saved, neither was seeking someone to complete them, neither was trying to fill voids through romance that only internal work could address. They'd both done that work separately, had both emerged whole and content alone, and now chose to intertwine two complete existences rather than desperately merge two incomplete ones. Their conversations ranged from philosophy to estate management, from personal struggles to political theory, from childhood wounds healed to future dreams worth pursuing. The mystery that captivated London wasn't really mysterious at all. It was simply what happens when two people stop performing and start being, stop needing and start choosing, stop seeking completion and start sharing abundance. And as their connection deepened into something undeniable, as society watched in shocked fascination while everything they'd believed about age and worth crumbled before their eyes, both Arabella and the Duke recognized they'd stumbled into something rare. Authentic love built on reality rather than fantasy, on mutual respect rather than desperate need, on chosen companionship rather than required rescue. Now let's talk about what you can actually do with this knowledge, because understanding Lady Arabella's transformation means nothing if you don't translate it into your own life. Here's the secret nobody wants you to discover. You don't need to wait for rock bottom or some dramatic catalyst to begin this journey. You can start today, right now, with decisions that seem small but carry revolutionary potential. The first principle is deceptively simple, yet profoundly challenging. Invest in yourself as if you're your own most important long-term project. Because you are. Not superficial investments in appearance or desperate attempts to become more marketable to potential partners, but deep, substantial work on the internal architecture of who you are. Arabella spent years neglecting her own development, pouring all her energy into making herself appealing to others, while her actual self atrophied like unused muscles. When she finally redirected that energy inward, everything shifted. Let me get practical about what this investment actually looks like. Because vague inspiration without concrete action changes nothing. Start with therapy or deep self-reflection work. Examine the wounds driving your behavior, the childhood patterns repeating in your relationships, the fears keeping you small and compliant. Arabella worked with a discreet counselor who helped her understand why she'd been choosing emotionally unavailable men, why she dimmed her intelligence around others, why external validation felt more real than self-acceptance. Read books that expand your consciousness, not just romance novels or light entertainment, but texts that challenge your thinking and broaden your perspective. She devoured works like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius for wisdom on self-control, Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke for understanding solitude's value, philosophical texts that made her think differently about existence and meaning. Develop actual skills that make you genuinely proud. Arabella learned advanced estate management, became fluent in 3 languages, studied investment strategies that grew her wealth independently. Each new capability added a layer of depth, made her more interesting to herself first, and others consequently. The second transformation requires brutal honesty and considerable courage. Build a life you genuinely love while single, a life so fulfilling that a relationship becomes enhancement rather than salvation. Here's the forbidden test that reveals whether you're ready for healthy partnership. If your potential partner disappeared tomorrow, completely and permanently, would your life crumble into meaningless ruins, or would it continue beautifully, albeit with sadness about the loss? If the answer is crumble, you're not ready. You're looking for rescue, not partnership. And that desperation will poison any connection you form. Arabella reached a point where her days overflowed with purpose, meaning, and joy independent of romantic status. Her mornings began with invigorating rides through countryside that cleared her mind, her afternoons filled with charitable work that connected her to community and purpose, her evenings devoted to learning, creating, or meaningful friendship. Romance could add dimension to this already rich existence, but couldn't define it. Think about the specific elements that make life genuinely satisfying rather than just bearable, because most people mistake absence of disaster for actual fulfillment. Develop hobbies that engage you so completely that hours disappear. For Arabella, it was translating ancient texts, breeding horses, and landscape design for her estate gardens. Cultivate friendships with the same devotion you'd give romantic relationships. She had a circle of accomplished women who challenged her thinking, supported her growth, and shared adventures that created memories independent of male involvement. Pursue work or creative projects that feel meaningful beyond financial necessity. Her charitable foundation for educating underprivileged girls gave her purpose that transcended personal benefit. Create rituals that make solitude feel luxurious rather than lonely. Her Sunday morning routine of reading in her conservatory with excellent tea and complete silence became sacred, something she protected fiercely even when courting began. These aren't distractions while waiting for real life to start with partnership. This is actual life, full and complete, that partnership might enhance, but never defines. The third principle cuts straight to the heart of why most people accept less than they deserve. Establish absolutely non-negotiable standards and refuse to compromise them regardless of how long you remain single. This terrifies people because it requires facing the possibility that you might never find someone who meets your requirements, that you might choose lifelong solitude over settling for less. But here's the hidden truth, the revelation that changes everything. Better to be genuinely happy alone than miserably coupled with someone who diminishes you. Arabella took time to articulate exactly what she wouldn't accept anymore, writing it down with uncompromising clarity. I will not tolerate emotional unavailability, intellectual laziness, cruelty disguised as honesty, controlling behavior masked as care, or anyone who requires me to be smaller so they can feel bigger. These weren't arbitrary preferences or superficial requirements about height or income. They were boundaries protecting her peace, her growth, her fundamental dignity. Write your own list, be specific and unflinching, then honor it religiously even when loneliness whispers that you're being too demanding. Your standards might include emotional intelligence and willingness to do internal work, genuine respect demonstrated through actions not just words, intellectual curiosity and growth mindset, financial responsibility even if wealth isn't required, shared values about major life issues, capacity for genuine intimacy, not just surface connection, consistency between what they claim and how they behave. The mystery isn't why some people remain single with high standards. It's why so many couple up with people who violate their deepest needs and then wonder why they're miserable. Low standards don't increase your chances of happiness. They just increase your chances of ending up with someone who makes you wish you'd stayed alone. The Duke met Arabella's exacting standards not because he was perfect, but because he'd done his own work, developed genuine depth, and was capable of the partnership she required. Had she compromised those standards for loneliness relief, she'd have missed him entirely, probably coupled with someone mediocre, while he eventually found someone else who matched his evolution. The fourth transformation requires developing what most people spend their lives avoiding: genuine emotional intelligence and the ability to communicate needs without drama or manipulation. This means learning to identify what you're actually feeling beneath reactive emotions, understanding the difference between legitimate needs and childhood wounds, demanding satisfaction, and articulating those needs clearly without attacking or guilt-tripping. Arabella studied this deliberately, reading works like Nonviolent Communication to understand how to express herself authentically without creating conflict, working with her counselor to recognize when old patterns were hijacking current situations. She learned that saying, "I feel anxious," when you don't respond to messages for days because it triggers my abandonment issues from childhood, and I'd appreciate more consistent communication, works infinitely better than, "You're so cold and distant, you obviously don't care about me." The first invites conversation and solution. The second creates defensiveness and distance. Men who've evolved beyond emotional infancy, the dukes rather than the boys, find emotionally regulated women incredibly attractive because it promises partnership without constant crisis management. They want someone who can discuss difficult topics calmly, who takes responsibility for their own feelings rather than making partners responsible for their emotional state, who can distinguish between past trauma and present reality. Practice this in all relationships, not just romantic ones. Notice when you're reacting from wounds rather than responding to actual circumstances. Learn to self-soothe before demanding others fix your discomfort. Communicate vulnerably without weaponizing that vulnerability for control. This work is hard, unglamorous, and never fully complete. But it's the foundation of every healthy connection. The vestiges of Arabella's old reactive patterns still surfaced occasionally, but she'd developed capacity to recognize them, take space if needed, and return to conversation from centered groundedness rather than emotional flooding. The fifth and final principle requires the most courage, the most contrary to instinct behavior. Be vulnerable strategically and authentically, but understand that vulnerability means sharing scars that have healed, not wounds still bleeding. There's this dangerous confusion in modern understanding of vulnerability where people think emotional vomiting equals intimacy, where oversharing every trauma and struggle demonstrates authenticity. But strategic vulnerability means choosing appropriate timing, depth, and context for sharing difficult truths. Arabella learned to share her past struggles with the Duke, her painful divorce, her struggles with self-worth, her mistakes and regrets, but she shared them as evidence of growth rather than current crisis requiring his rescue. She'd say things like, "I used to struggle terribly with abandonment anxiety, and I've done significant work to heal that pattern. Sometimes echoes still surface, but I'm aware of them and can manage them productively now." This demonstrates self-awareness, growth, and emotional intelligence, rather than warning him he'd be responsible for managing her unhealed wounds. Think about the difference between "I'm broken and need you to fix me" versus "I've been broken, did the hard work to heal, and can share that journey with you from a place of integration rather than desperation." The first creates caretaking dynamics where he becomes your therapist rather than your partner. The second creates genuine intimacy between equals. Share your vulnerabilities with people who've earned that trust through demonstrated consistency and care, not as testing grounds or manipulation tactics to create false intimacy quickly. The codes of authentic connection reveal that real vulnerability builds gradually, deepening naturally as trust accumulates through repeated small demonstrations of reliability and care. Arabella didn't trauma dump on the Duke during their first conversation, but as months passed and he proved himself trustworthy, she gradually revealed deeper layers, not to create obligation through pity, but to allow genuine knowing to develop between them. And it was precisely this measured, authentic vulnerability, paired with her demonstrated capability and emotional regulation, that created the foundation for love that could sustain lifetimes. These weren't just abstract principles she followed. They were daily practices that transformed her from desperate to magnetic, from needy to chosen, from overlooked to utterly irresistible to exactly the right person. Now, let's pull back the curtain and expose the conspiracy that's been operating in plain sight. The deliberate lies society feeds you about age, worth, and the supposed desperation you should feel as time passes. There's an entire industry built on your fear, an intricate web of financial interests that profit enormously when you believe you're running out of time, when panic replaces discernment, when you'll accept anything rather than face the silence of your own company. The beauty and anti-aging industry alone generates billions annually by convincing women that their value depletes with every passing year, that wrinkles equal worthlessness, that youth is the only currency worth possessing in the marriage marketplace. They need you desperate, scrambling for solutions, willing to buy any product or procedure that might reverse the inevitable passage of time. Think about it. A woman confident in her worth at 40, comfortable in her skin, unbothered by society's arbitrary timelines, she's not profitable. She's not controllable. She's downright dangerous to entire economic sectors built on her insecurity. The secret they desperately want to keep hidden is brutally simple. Desperate women spend more money, accept worse treatment, and remain easier to manipulate and control. When you believe your biological clock is ticking like a time bomb, when every birthday past 35 feels like stepping closer to romantic extinction, you become vulnerable to exploitation. You'll buy the creams, the treatments, the procedures, anything promising to slow your supposed decline into unmarriageability. You'll tolerate disrespectful behavior from mediocre men because you've been convinced they're your last chances. You'll compromise your standards, ignore red flags, silence your instincts, all because the forbidden truth has been hidden from you. Women's value doesn't diminish with age. It transforms, deepens, becomes more selective, and therefore more valuable to men who've evolved beyond superficial preferences. But acknowledging this reality would collapse entire industries, so they feed you fear instead. Fear that sells products, fear that keeps you small, fear that ensures continued profitability. Let me expose another layer of this hidden agenda because it extends far beyond commercial interests into social control mechanisms that have operated for centuries. A woman who's genuinely fulfilled without male partnership, who's built a complete life independent of romantic validation, who refuses to settle for less than she deserves, regardless of age. She represents a fundamental threat to traditional power structures. The entire social framework has historically depended on women feeling incomplete without husbands, desperate for the economic security and social legitimacy that marriage provided. But when women like Lady Arabella demonstrate that fulfillment, prosperity, and social contribution exist independent of marital status, when they show that peace alone surpasses misery partnered, the whole narrative crumbles. This is why society pushes the urgency so hard, why your unmarried aunts are pitied at family gatherings, why questions about your romantic life dominate conversations while your professional achievements get polite nods. They need you coupled, preferably young and grateful for whoever chooses you, because your independence threatens their fundamental assumptions about feminine worth and purpose. Here's the enigma wrapped inside the conspiracy. Men of genuine value, the evolved dukes rather than the entitled lords, they actually prefer women who've lived, learned, and developed substance through experience. They find the depth that comes with age infinitely more compelling than the blank slate appeal of youth. The Duke of Ravenswood had his pick of debutantes fresh from finishing school, young women's society considered in their prime. Yet he chose Arabella at 40 because she offered something youth simply cannot provide. Wisdom earned through mistakes, confidence born from self-knowledge, conversation enriched by actual life experience, emotional regulation developed through deliberate internal work. But admitting this reality would undermine the entire apparatus of feminine panic that keeps women controllable and profitable. So society perpetuates the lie that youth equals peak value. They need you believing that men universally prefer younger women, that experience diminishes rather than enhances your appeal, that your 30s and 40s represent decline rather than ascension into your most magnificent self. The vestiges of old patriarchal control mechanisms persist in modern clothing, disguised as concern for your happiness, while actually serving systems that profit from your insecurity. When your mother anxiously asks about your dating life, when friends express pity about your single status, when media constantly reinforces narratives of women left behind by time, these aren't neutral observations. They're enforcement mechanisms ensuring compliance with expectations that never served you anyway. The conflicting messages reveal the manipulation. Society simultaneously tells you that you need a partner to be complete, while ensuring you feel increasingly unworthy of quality partnership as you age. This creates the perfect storm of desperation, where you'll accept scraps and call them blessings, where you'll ignore your own needs to avoid the shame of remaining unpartnered, where you'll compromise your very soul to escape the social stigma they've artificially created and maintained. But here's the revelation that dismantles their entire framework, the forbidden knowledge that sets you free. You at 40, with self-knowledge, healed wounds, clear boundaries, and genuine self-love, are infinitely more valuable than you at 25, with insecurity, people-pleasing tendencies, and desperate need for external validation. Your worth hasn't diminished. It's been refined, distilled, concentrated into something far more rare and precious. The right man, the evolved man, the man actually capable of the partnership you deserve. He recognizes this immediately. He's not shopping for blank canvases to project his preferences onto. He's seeking a masterpiece already complete, someone whose depth matches his evolution, whose substance complements his growth. The tragedy isn't women aging out of desirability. It's women believing lies designed to keep them desperate and diminished, accepting less than they deserve because fear replaced discernment. Lady Arabella's story isn't exceptional or miraculous. It's what happens when you reject the conspiracy, trust your own worth, and refuse to let society's profitable lies determine your choices. And once you see the manipulation clearly, once you recognize the agenda behind the urgency, you can finally make decisions from power rather than panic, from wisdom rather than fear, from authentic self-worth rather than desperate validation-seeking. So here we are, at the end of Lady Arabella's journey and the beginning of yours. Everything you've just learned about the lies society tells you, about the transformations that create genuine magnetism, about choosing yourself before anyone else chooses you, it all means absolutely nothing if it stays as inspiration that fades by tomorrow morning. The real question burning right now isn't whether Arabella's story moved you, but whether you'll actually do something with this knowledge, or let fear and old patterns pull you right back into accepting less than you deserve. Because here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to face. You already know what needs to change in your life. You know which standards you've been compromising, which parts of yourself you've been dimming to make others comfortable, which desperate behaviors you've been excusing as just wanting love. The mystery isn't what to do. It's whether you'll find the courage to actually do it. Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if it stings. If you disappeared from your own life right now, would you miss it? Not the people in it, not the potential of what it could become, but the actual life you're living today. Would it be worth mourning? Or have you been so busy waiting for real life to start when the right person arrives that you've forgotten to build something beautiful in the meantime? Lady Arabella spent years in that limbo, postponing joy until partnership materialized, and she'll tell you those were the most wasted years of her existence. Not because she was single, but because she wasn't really living, just marking time, just maintaining, just existing in the spaces between desperate attempts to secure someone's attention. The secret she discovered, and I'm handing you right now, is this. Your life starts the moment you decide it does, regardless of relationship status, regardless of age, regardless of whether anyone's watching or validating your choices. Here's what I want you to do today, not next week, when motivation fades, not after you finish just one more disappointing situationship, but today. Write down the 3 standards you've been compromising and why. Be brutally specific. Maybe you've been accepting inconsistent communication because you're afraid of seeming demanding. Maybe you've been tolerating disrespect because you believe your age makes you less deserving of consideration. Maybe you've been performing a smaller version of yourself because you're terrified that your full authenticity will scare people away. Whatever it is, name it clearly, because you cannot change what you refuse to acknowledge. Then, underneath each compromised standard, write what you're going to do differently starting now. Not vague intentions like, demand better, but specific actions like, I will no longer respond to messages from people who disappear for weeks without explanation. Or, I will speak up when conversation turns to topics I'm knowledgeable about instead of pretending ignorance. Make these commitments forbidden territory that you refuse to violate regardless of how lonely you feel, because your peace is worth more than their crumbs. Now let me get provocative for a moment, because comfortable questions don't catalyze transformation. What are you more afraid of? Remaining single and building a genuinely fulfilling life alone, or coupling up with someone mediocre and spending decades wondering what you sacrificed for the illusion of companionship? Because those are your actual options if you don't change course. You can keep doing what you've been doing, accepting whatever attention comes your way, compromising your standards because society whispers that time's running out, performing smaller versions of yourself to avoid scaring people off. And that path leads exactly where it's been leading, to relationships that drain rather than energize you, to partnerships that diminish rather than expand you, to years wasted on people who never deserved access to your depths. Or you can choose Arabella's path, the harder one initially, but infinitely more rewarding, building yourself into someone so complete, so genuinely magnetic, so unapologetically authentic, that you naturally attract partnership that enhances rather than defines your already beautiful existence. The conspiracy wants you paralyzed by urgency, making desperate decisions from fear of being left behind. But here's the revelation that dismantles their entire framework. You're not running out of time. You're running into your power. Every year that passes isn't diminishing your worth. It's refining it, concentrating it, transforming you into something far more valuable than youth alone could ever offer. The right person, the evolved person, the Duke rather than the desperate. Lord, they're not shopping for blank canvases or projects requiring fixing. They want someone who's done the work, someone whose depth matches their evolution, someone who chooses them from abundance rather than needs them from scarcity. But you cannot attract that level of partnership while operating from desperation, while compromising your standards, while performing versions of yourself, designed to appeal rather than reveal. The magnetism Arabella developed, the presence that captured someone exceptional, that emerges only from genuine self-worth, from building a life you genuinely miss if relationship required you to sacrifice it, from becoming so complete that partnership becomes optional rather than mandatory. So I'm going to leave you with one final question, the one that'll determine whether this was just entertainment or actual catalyst for change. 1 year from today, do you want to be essentially where you are now? Same patterns, same compromises, same frustrations with different faces attached? Or do you want to look back and recognize this as the moment everything shifted? Because transformation doesn't happen through passive consumption of content. It happens through deliberate, uncomfortable action taken consistently even when motivation fades and old fears resurface. Arabella's journey from mocked to magnetic wasn't magic or luck. It was the compound effect of daily choices to honor herself, to build genuine substance, to refuse anything less than she deserved, regardless of how long she waited. That same transformation is available to you, starting right now, but only if you actually implement what you've learned instead of just feeling inspired and then returning to old patterns by tomorrow. Here's what I need from you. Don't let this be another piece of content you consume and forget. If what you've learned today resonated, if Lady Arabella's story revealed possibilities you'd stopped believing existed, then subscribe to this channel and activate notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because we're just getting started, there's so much more to uncover about authentic attraction, about building genuine confidence, about recognizing and avoiding the manipulation tactics that keep you settling for less. The Forbidden Knowledge Society doesn't want you discovering the codes of magnetism nobody teaches, the truth about what actually creates lasting connection beyond surface-level attraction. We're going to explore all of it, breaking down every lie they've told you about your worth, and replacing it with truth that actually serves you. But more than subscribing, I need you to commit to one concrete action today based on what you've learned. Just one. Maybe it's finally ending that situationship that's been stealing your energy, while offering nothing substantial. Maybe it's investing in yourself through therapy or education you've been postponing. Maybe it's simply deciding that you're done performing smaller versions of yourself for anyone's comfort. Whatever it is, do it today while the revelation is still fresh. Because tomorrow the old patterns will whisper that you're being too demanding, too difficult, too much. And I need you armed with truth when those lies inevitably resurface. Your story doesn't end at 40 or 50. Or any arbitrary age society tries to convince you represents decline. It evolves, deepens, becomes more interesting precisely because you've lived, learned, and refused to let experience diminish you. The best chapters might still be unwritten, the most magnetic version of yourself might still be emerging, and the partnership you actually deserve might be waiting for you to become someone who won't settle for anything less. But none of that happens accidentally. It happens through deliberate choice, through uncomfortable growth, through refusing to accept the lies that have kept you small and afraid. Lady Arabella stopped being society's cautionary tale the moment she stopped believing their narrative about her worth, and you can do exactly the same, starting right now. So subscribe, activate those notifications, take that one concrete action today, and let's continue this journey together. Because you deserve so much more than you've been accepting, and it's time you finally believed that enough to demand it. C'est de toi.